In 1796, a work of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings was consigned to the flames. What were the specific passages in this book that some deemed so objectionable? Exploring this will help us uncover the most fundamental theological difference between Chasidim and non-Chasidim at the turn of the 19th century. We're going to begin tonight with a letter that the Alter Rebbe sent either in the year Tov Kuf Nun Vav in 1796 or in Tov Kuf Nun Zayin in 1797. And this is a letter that he sent to the Anash, to Hasidim who were living in Vilna. It was a very difficult place to be a Chassid in the 1790s in Vilna, because that's where you had the focal point of his Snagdus. Wasn't only in Vilna, but one of the primary places was in Vilna. And as a result, the Chassidim who lived there, they had it more difficult than Chassidim who were living in other places. And they were corresponding with the Alter Rebbe. And the Alter Rebbe, in response, writes to them as follows. Regarding the fact that they burnt the known Sefer. What's the known Sefer? We'll see in a second. It is not for you to fight and to wage the Baal Shem Tov's war. Don't think you have to exact retribution and to fix this and to wage war and to cause fights. This is not something that you need to do. He quotes a pasuk, this is not the path, this is not what Hashem wants. Let it go, leave it alone. Don't think that you need to retaliate. What sefer are we talking about? So we have evidence of a sreifa from a letter that was sent by the official leadership in the Vilna community around the same time, in the summer of Tov Kuf Nun Vav, 1796. And it's a long letter. And basically they write one or two lines in the letter. It says as follows. V'hachasid, referring here to the Vilna Goin. The Vilna Goin was the leader of the Hisnagdus at the time, but interestingly, he was always called Chassid. Both the Alter Rebbe called him the Chassid, as well as Jews in Vilna called him the Chassid. He was known as the pious one. This is before the name Chasidim really became cemented in the way that it became in later years. So they're writing that HaChasid bi'er hakas halazu b'kehila kadosha Vilna, that the Gra did everything within his power to get rid of this kas, this group, this sect of Chasidim, to the degree possible. The Gam, in addition, hine saraf et tzavas harivash, he burnt the tzavas harivash. The tzavas harivash is a sefer that was published in, as far as we can tell, in 1793 is the first dated print of this sefer, a few years before this. It was not written by, Rivash stands for Rebbe Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. It's not written by the Baal Shem Tov. It was written by students of Baal Shem Tov, and it contains his Torah. So they're saying here in Tov Kuf Nun Vav, in Iyar or Sivan, that the Gra burnt the Tzavas Harivash b'soich kahal va'eda asif haraba in public. And when koydem bir chametz, presumably it was Erev Pesach that year, there anyway was a fire going on in town, so it was convenient, and so the Sefer Tzavas Harivash was burnt. And so Kenida, the Alter Rebbe is writing about that to the Chasidim. We could understand that they were very offended, they were traumatized, they were horrified that a sefer that they cherished, that a sefer that they studied from was burnt in their Daled Amis. They wanted to take measures to perhaps figure out a way to retaliate. And the Alter Rebbe's response was that this is not the way that we need to, behave. So the question that I want to use to drive tonight's shir is, why was this sefer burnt? In other words, one way of saying it is, well, there was a machloikas between Chasidim and Misnagdim, and so because this was the book of the Chasidim, so therefore we burnt the book. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is to say, maybe there is actually content within the book itself. Was there content within the book itself that they found objectionable? Were there certain passages that they would have pointed to and say, no, this passage is a problematic passage? Or again, no, the first way I said is that we have a dispute, for whatever reason we have a dispute. I don't like your Anhagas, we don't like our Anhagas, you daven in a certain way, you travel to Rebbe in a certain way, and so irrespective of what it says in the book, we're going to get rid of the book. So I'm going to argue, we're going to present the case that there were specific passages, the evidence suggests there were specific passages in the Sefer that they found problematic. And if so, then our question is, which ones were they? It would be interesting to know which were the passages that were found to be most offensive. I should just note that when it says here, the Gra burnt the Sefer Tzavos Rivash, I don't think anyone assumes this means that the Gra literally stood there and took the Sefer and consigned it to the flames, just like no one thinks that the prior sentence, where it says that he tried to get rid of them from Vilna, means that he went around with his own bare hands driving them out of the city. It just means that he oversaw it, or he gave haskama to it, or he allowed it to happen. So just like it means that in the first clause of that paragraph, that's what it probably means in the second clause of the paragraph as well. Okay, but back to our main question. Our main question here, what were the passages in this Sefer that were found to be objectionable? So in order to understand this, we have to take a deeper look at this same letter and understand the context of this same letter. This letter, which we just read from the Alter Rebbe as 2 lines, the first 2 lines that we read, comes from a much longer letter, and this letter is very, very important to understand what was going on between Chasidim and Misnagdim in the year 1796, 1797. This letter is indispensable, and get many, many answers to these questions come from this letter. So we're going to read a few parts of this letter. So it's addressed to Anash Haminyan Dekilas Kodesh Vilna, and what is the letter about? So in the words of the Alter Rebbe, it's Bidvar Havikuach Imsha Kenegdenu. It's regarding the disputation with those who are opposed to us. As is going to become clear for the Hemshech of the letter, what happened here was that someone came up with Hatzah. Looks like the Misnagdim in Vilna came up with Hatzah. And they said, you know what, for once and for all, we're going to resolve this by the way of disputation, right? This is when the time when people believed that this is a way you're able to resolve differences of opinion, is by we're going to have a disputation, and this is going to resolve for all the problems. And they had a certain system that they came up with, that basically the Gra was going to send his shliach. They even have his name in the letter. His name was going to be a certain Reb Sadia, and Reb Sadia was going to represent the Gra's views, and Alter Rebbe was going to represent the views of the Hasidim, and there were going to be 2 judges, unnamed. There were going to be 2 judges, and they're going to decide who's right and who's wrong, and this is the vikuach. So the Hasidim in Vilna want to know, beside for complaining about this fact that Tzavos Rivash was burnt and what can we do about it, and the Alter Rebbe said nothing. In addition, they wanted to know, what does the Alter Rebbe think about this proposal, about having this disputation? Says the Alter Rebbe as follows: if it were possible to actually make peace, there's nothing greater than making peace. Your proposal itself is not really going to be effective, because you're not introducing anything new over here, because everything you're proposing we already tried. And here the Alter Rebbe, amongst other things, says what happened about 25 years earlier, in the year Tov Kuf Lamed Beis, and way back in 1772, when he and his colleague, Reb Mendel Haradoker, went to Vilna to have a meeting with the Gra in order to resolve the differences and the issues then. So the Alter Rebbe writes in the letters as follows: V'alachnu, in the year 1772, we went, we went to the Gra. Here you see he's using the word Chassid. We went to the Gra in his home, to have a discussion and a debate with him, and that he should remove his tightness from us. By this time, the writing of this letter in the 1790s, in the late 1790s, Mendel Haradoker had already passed away in Eretz Yisrael. However, rather than achieving this meeting, 2 separate occasions, he slammed the door in our face. And then the leaders of the city said to him, Rabbeinu, they were speaking to the Gra, the Hasidic rabbi came, came to have a debate with you. And when you defeat him, this, we're going to bring peace unto Israel. So in other words, the members of the community encouraged the Gra to have this discussion, and nonetheless, he came up with various reasons why he didn't want to do this. And when they started pushing him, he left town. And he waited till he heard a report that we left, as you guys are young. You guys are the Hasidim writing in 1796. You weren't around in 1772, so you don't really know the whole Maisa. But those who were around in the early 1770s, they remember this Maisa. And so in other words, he didn't want to have a discussion with us. Why? Because he has certain views. He has certain views. They're well thought out views. And he has certain opinions. So the question is, what's going to change now? What changed now? We didn't hear, he goes on in this letter to say, we didn't hear any reason to believe that his views changed. And so if his views didn't change, why would we assume that this disputation that you're saying now is going to solve the problem? You're saying, no, he's not going to be the judge. There's going to be two other people who are, so to speak, independent who are going to be the judge. Says the Alter Rebbe, no, I know now. I realize, I understand that's what you're saying. However, that's not a wise proposal. Obviously, these two people are not going to be as important as him, and therefore they're not going to be able to say you're wrong. And so therefore, this is it's not going to be a fair trial, essentially. And so therefore, there's no reason to go ahead with this proposal. Instead, the Alter Rebbe goes on in the next paragraph to say, this is really what we could and should do. We should have the meeting. We should have the meeting, face to face. I want to meet with him face to face. And I will explain to him my point of view, which I never had the opportunity to do for 25 years. I should finally be given the opportunity that he should hear me out. Then, if he doesn't like what he said, he should make his tainas in writing. Alter Rebbe says, obviously the girl wouldn't write it himself, Alter Rebbe suggests, but he would dictate it to a secretary, he would write it down, the girl would sign it, the Alter Rebbe would then issue a written response, and then the lashon is they would send it l'chol chachmei Yisrael ha'kroivim v'ha'rechoikim. They'll send it to people who are out of Lita, out of this area where the Gra reigns supreme, and they'll send it to many Gdolim, the Ashkenazim, and the Sfardim, all independent people. And here, Alter Rebbe assumed that this had a chance of working, I guess, even though when you think about it, I mean, would this really work? Would that really have worked? That question doesn't need to be answered because at the end of the day, they weren't going to go ahead with that proposal anyway. But the Alter Rebbe was suggesting that it could have worked, and Acharit Avim Lahatais would then follow the majority of V'zeh Yiyah Shalom Al Yisrael. So this is a little more background of what's going on in this letter. The part that we read before about the Sreifa, that comes later at the end of the letter, where it's a separate point, and that is don't get too agitated over the burning of the book. But the main part of the letter is about whether it's a good idea to have this disputation now or not. Now, along the way in this letter, the Alter Rebbe also lays out what are the real philosophical, theological differences between him, Chassidus, and the Gra. And this becomes, once the reason the Alter Rebbe says this is because he wants to show how far apart the two sides are, which he feels it's important to do in this letter, to say, like, this is going to be a really, really challenging thing, and this is why a local Rav who is subordinate to the Gra is never going to be able to go against him on a matter of such theological importance. And so therefore, what happens in this letter, the Alter Rebbe summarizes what are these big philosophical issues. So we want to read that. In order for us to read that, we'll get there shortly, we need to take a step back and we need to look at a different issue, a different discussion. And that is as follows. In general, when we read through Sefer Breishis of the Torah, Sefer Shmos of the Torah, and throughout the whole Tanakh, you're constantly getting the message that's against Avodah Zarah. What's Avodah Zarah? Is when you say something of nature is God. When you equate something of nature as God, that's Avodah Zarah. You can't worship the sun, you can't worship the moon or whatever. So we know that that's an issue that's the Torah is always fighting against, battling against. You should know, don't confuse nature with the Eibusher. The Eibusher transcends nature. In other words, there's an entity that stands above Shemayim, who stands above Aretz, and he created it. The Eibusher created the Shemesh and the Yareach, which tells you that he stands above the Shemesh and the Yareach. Fine. Good, that's a very pashta thing that we learn Tanakh. Then there's another error. We spoke about this a few weeks ago in a different shir, and that's the error of Avzav Hashem Es Haaretz. That people say God created the world and he left it to its own devices, he's not involved. So when we read Tanakh, what's the message again and again in Tanakh? Nishtazoi, what's in Parshas Va'era? What are we reading about? God's intervention in nature in order to save the Jewish people and get them out of Mitzrayim. The Eibusher is involved. So that's also Teignish. So many of these big theological questions are answered in Tanakh. But let's ask a different question. That is, where is God? Where is the Eibusher? So interestingly, here you don't have such a clear answer in the Torah, in Tanakh, to this question. On the one hand, and we'll see, you could quote a pasuk that says, "As Shemaim v'saret ani male," which is a pasuk in Yirmiyah. That sounds, God says, I fill up all of the heaven and earth. That sounds like we say omnipresence, which means the Eibusher is everywhere. On the other hand, you have a pasuk such as Hamashbili Shaves, Hamashbili Liros B'Shamayim V'Aretz, which we say in Tehillim, in Hallel, that the Eibishter is transcends and is only Hamashbili Liros B'Shamayim V'Aretz. He's only watching, he's only looking, but he himself, he's somewhere up there. And likewise, you go through many of the psukim in Tanakh, you could kind of have a discussion. Is it sound more like this? Does it sound more like that? Really, just in the psukim in Tanakh, you can make a whole class just on that. And likewise, when you go to Safros Chazal, it's a very interesting question. Most of this is in the Agadata, which itself is hard to interpret. But you have different Agadatas that get into the discussion of where the placement is of the Eibishter. Really, you could do that just looking at Chazal, at Midrashim, at passages in the Gemara to get into this discussion. But the place where this really comes to a head and where the discussion, we're going to pick up the discussion, is in Kisvei Arizal. And that's because the Arizal, who passed away in the year 1572 without writing his Torah. But he had a student, he had a number of students, many students. One of his students, his star student, was Reb Chaim Vital, who obviously lived on after his Rebbe passed away. Reb Chaim Vital himself passed away in 1620. And he did write many of the teachings of the Arizal, including the Sefer Eitz Chaim. And in the Sefer Eitz Chaim, it describes a concept of Tzimtzum. And as we read these lines and these words, it's probably a good idea to strip anything that you ever heard about Tzimtzum when you're reading these lines, and just try to focus on the Pashta Pshat of this passage. And here we'll see that l'chayra, what's happening here is a discussion of where the Eibishter is happening in these lines, as we'll see. So let's read the Eitz Chaim. You should know, so this is before the world of Atzilus came about. Tonight's not the time to talk about what Atzilus is. V'nivru anivroim, and before you had the Nivroim, that is Bria, Yetzira, Asiya. Again, not our point today to get into this discussion. But anyway, before all this came about, you had a lofty and pashut means not made up of many different levels, right? Netzalim and Nivroim, there's 10 spheres, there's many different levels. Pashut means ein zach. So this was Mamale Kolametzias, took up all of existence. With no vacuum. It's all filled with the infinite light. When God had a desire to create and to make Atzilus, so then God retracted himself, constricted himself, removed himself. It's not entirely clear what the perfect taich is for the word Tzimtzum. And then Nishar then you had a vacuum, you had empty space, in the middle. Why? Because you had Or Sof, so to speak, moving to the sides. And so therefore you had this emptiness in the middle. So now you have a place. This corresponds to the four worlds. Then you had a place where you could have Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Okay? And then, after we had the empty space, God extended one from Ein Sof, one pathway, one channel, min ha'oira igul shaloi, from this oira igul. Remember, because the oir is now around, because it was removed. Milmaila lamata, from the top to the bottom, and it pierces its way through this empty space. So you have Ein Sof is around, you have this kind of empty space, and now a kav pierced its way through, and it says kozeh. In other words, when it was written in manuscripts, there would be an image there. When it was printed in Svarim, so it depends which prints. The early prints don't have any image there. The later prints of the Eitz Chaim, they actually started printing. You have a circle with a kav and you have a diagram. And that is how Or Sof, which now is like outside the picture, how does Or Sof get into the picture? Through this kav, through this channel. And now in this empty space, before he said you were able to have the Dalet Olamis. Now he says that now that we have the Kav kind of moving its way through, so now it happened in actuality. He'etzil, Ubara, V'yatzar, V'asa, again a reference to all four worlds, Kol Ha'olamos Kula. So obviously when we read this on a very plain level, it does sound like the Arizal is getting into a discussion of where the Eibishter is. And it does sound like he's saying that he's not really here, unless we want to talk about the Kav, which is some sort of Bigadol. Largely he's not here, except for with the Kav, but the Arizal seems to be having that type of a discussion. And indeed, there were Mikubalim that came along and said that this is what the Arizal meant. Most famous is known as the Mishnas Chasidim. He's known as the Mishnas Chasidim because that's his main Kabbalistic work, is the Mishnas Chasidim. His name was Rebbe Rafal Emanuel Riki. His dates are 1687 to 1743. For context, the Alter Rebbe, we assume, was born in 1745, 2 years after he passed away. Anyway, in his Sefer Yosher Levav, Rebbe Rafal Emanuel Chai Riki writes as follows: if you care about the honor of God, you need to think of this Tzimtzum in a literal way. In other words, already in his day, by his day, there were others who got into a discussion. They use this words, kipshutoi or not kipshutoi, literal or not literal. Rebbe Raphael is not starting the conversation, he's continuing the conversation, and he says that you need to think of it literally. Why? Leval yifkoin b'chvoidoi, so that you don't offend God, b'chashvoi, by assuming sha'atzmusai nimtza gam begashmiyim hashvelim habilti nichbadim, so that you don't assume that God's essence is present in lowly, non-respectable existences, va'af benivzim, and disgraceful things. This is not my own opinion. Again, if you read the Arizal, it's kipshutoi. This is what the Arizal says. And then he goes on to say as follows. It makes more sense for me to say this. What am I going to do with the Zohar? What happens? The Zohar says, he brings from the Tikkun Zohar that says, there is no place void of God, whether in the highest places or the lowest places. That sounds different. That sounds like saying God is omnipresent and is everywhere. So what does the Mishnah Chassidim, what does Rebbe Rafal Emanuel Chai Riki do with that? He says, I rather reinterpret that. I rather interpret that to say that it's referring to Hashgacha Pratis. There is no place that is devoid of God's providence. God's not there. You could oversee something, you could be in charge of something, you could pull the strings in something, and at the same time, so to speak, not be there. And that's how I want to understand the Zohar. And he would say any pasuk, as we mentioned before, the pasuk, Shema v'saretz ani malei. How would he interpret Shema v'saretz ani malei? My hashgacha pervades all of existence. There is no place that's outside of my gaze. That's how you would want to interpret it. So he does that for the psukim, and he does that for the Zohar as well. And he says, I prefer to do that than by degrading God than saying that he's b'mekaymes bilti ruyim. And he says, it's one thing to say that you have a glorious king who looks out of his window of his palace and he sees that there's something offensive on the street. Okay, no. And then he commands his guards to go and move it up and clean up. Not such a big deal. But to say that that same king, not only gazing through the window to see it, but that he's present within it, that's already crosses a line, and it's too much, and we can't say this about the Eibishter. And he concludes the piece saying, and that's why we say, Hamagbi lo shaves, hamashpil lirois. That the Eibishter is Magbi lo shaves, he transcends it all. He can't say that he's here, he's not here. But mashpil lirois, his gaze is here. He's in full control of everything that's happening. This is how Rebbe Rafal Emanuel Chai Riki, the Baal Mishnas Chassidim, this is how he writes on this subject. And again, he says, if you read Arizal, that's what you walk away with. Because the Arizal is telling us that you have the concept of the siluk, where the Ur and Saf is removed, and then you add a little bit of a chazar v'heyer, but largely we're able to look and say, this is a makom chala. This is an empty space that is devoid of the Eibishter. However, there were other mikubalim in the same generation who disagreed. And the one we're going to look at, the most famous one, his name was Rabbi Yosef Irgas. He was in Italy. By the way, the Mishnah Chassidim was also, there was a lot of Kabbalah at this time in Italy. The Mishnah Chassidim was from Italy, but he really moved around. He went to Allah, he moved to Eretz Yisrael. He lived in many different places. Rabbi Yosef Irgas, I believe, was the Rav in Livorno. And he wrote a Sefer Shomer Emunim. And a big part of this Sefer is defending Kabbalah, because you had, in this time, detractors. People said that it's not a good thing to learn. And there were other people who wrote even Sfarim, even Gedolei Yisrael. So he had the right to, so to speak, defend Kabbalah. And so the whole work, Shomer Emunim, is written to defend Kabbalah. And the way he did it is he set it up as a dialogue. There was a certain style that was common in the classical period with the Greeks. And then during the Renaissance, a lot of the writers in Italy, and this carried over to Yidden as well, when they wrote Sfarim, they wrote as a dialogue. If you remember, we did the Kuzri Sheni, right? So that was written by an author, also who came from Italy. Later he moved to London, Reb David Nato. He wrote a sefer as a dialogue. So here also he wrote a sefer as a dialogue. The dialogue's between two people. One, his name is Yehoyada, and one's name is Shaltiel. The names are significant. What's Yohayada mean? Yohayada sounds like he knows God. In other words, he has the answers. What's Shaltiel? He's asking about God. So in other words, there's the Shaltiel, the person who's asking, and there's Yohayada, the person who's answering. So Yohayada here, the rabbi is speaking. He's a ben doirei of the Mishnas Chassidim. He was born mamish within a few years of him. Anyway, so Rabbi Yosef Irgas says as follows. He writes in Yohayada says as follows. Dabini, you should know Shaltiel, here the teacher, so to speak, telling the questioner. If you're going to assume that Tzimtzum is literal, you are going to stumble in many different problems and errors when it comes to some of the foundations of our faith. And I will lay this out for you one at a time. And he goes on to make 10 arguments against Tzimtzum Kipshutai. We're only going to look at two of them. Ha'alef, the first one, Hine Kasuv Hadaru. You have a Befedish pasuk that says, Ve'elmi tidamyun kel. Who can you compare God to? Umat mus ta'archuloi. And what type of image, figure, can you provide for Hashem? You can't. God doesn't have a figure. However, if you say Tzimtzum is literal, so now you're giving God some sort of image. The yoikna is the Greek word. It's related to the word icon. Yoikna, the icon. So you're giving God a certain icon. You're giving him a certain image. That's not acceptable. Because you're saying that he has a circumference, that he has a surrounding circle, and then empty space in the middle, and then a kav yashar, a straight channel in the middle. This is spatial. You're talking here about place. You're talking about a tzir, an image, a figure. God is above figure, and so therefore you run into a big problem over here by talking about moving to the right, to the left, and a circle, and an empty space, and a kav, all this, that runs afoul of the fact that the Eibusher doesn't have any tzir. Number one. Number two, hahei. Problem number 5. We're jumping to problem 5. Isa bezayar chadash, he quotes from the Zohar, and many places from the Zohar says as follows. Leis hasar dalav iu taman. There is no place where God isn't. Le'ela adein saf, all the way up. Uletata adein tachlis, all the way down. Ulechol sitra, and to all sides. Now, the Yosher Levov knew that, and he quoted the Zohar, and he said, the way I'm going to interpret it is that it's referring to Hashkacha Pratis. There is no place where his Hashkacha doesn't extend. Well, he says that's not the Pashta Pshat of the Zohar. The Zohar doesn't seem to be talking about Hashkacha. The Zohar seems to be talking about the presence of the Eibishter. And if the Tzimtzum is literal, you're essentially stating that there's a place where God isn't. Because in the entire empty space, you only got one kav there for the Eibusher, implying that in 99% of this empty space that God isn't there. That goes against the Zohar. So that is his 5th argument. Again, he brings 10. Now, Shaltiel listens to all of these arguments. He's the one who asks the questions, and he asks a very good question at the end. And he says, "In Keinefo, if you're right, can you please explain to me? Why did the Arizal say this clearly? Now, it doesn't mean the Arizal, it means Reb Chaim Vital. Why didn't Reb Chaim Vital write this clearly? In other words, you read it, Eitz Chaim wouldn't have hurt if he just would have added one line over there that would have said, by the way, oh, this is a mashal. Well, that one line isn't there. So it's actually a very, very good question. He goes on to answer. Yeah, but if you look elsewhere in the Arizal said this, and you look elsewhere he said this, and you put it all together, it becomes very clear. Fine. It's a good argument, but the question is also a very, very good question, which is why I left it in. Okay, so the bottom line is, what happens here? We have an Arizal and we have a debate. Tzimtzum Kipshutai, not Kipshutai. This is a debate that we already see in the 1600s or the early 1700s, before Chasidim, before Misnagdim, before the Baal Shem Tov, is something that's being disputed. We showed 2 Bikubalim. There were many others, but there were numerous others that were involved in this discussion as well during that time. Now the question is, what shita did Chasidus go with? And what shita did the Baal Shem Tov go with? So already when you open up the Sefer Tzavos or Rivash, you're able to see, you can, if you want to have fun, go through the Torahs one after another and put a check for each one that basically assumes that Tzimtzum is not literal. In other words, put a check by each one that assumes that God is present, mamish, in everything all of the time. And there are many of them. Let's quote a few of them. So here's Tzavos or Rivash. Kuf Lamed Zayin. Yachshoy, a person should think, he's present everywhere. V'shchinasai tamid etzloi, Hashem Shechina is right with you. V'yachshoy, and you should think, just when you look at physical things, at a bottle, at a table, at a napkin, so too God should be so near to you. Right? You should think and believe the Shechina is with you, and guarding you. Think about the fact that you're looking at God. You're looking at God. And God is looking at you. That's teaching number 1. Next teaching. Let's say you're davening and you hear someone speaking. Yomar, this is what you should tell yourself. Why would God bring that person to be disturbing me in the middle of my prayer? All of this is divine providence. Now, our topic tonight is not Hashgacha Pratis. As we already saw, you could hold God, so to speak, removed himself from the world, and you could still have Hashgacha Pratis. It happens to be the Baal Shem Tov has a big teaching, a big emphasis on Hashgacha Pratis, which we're seeing now. So far, what we discussed, the fact that someone is talking next to you, disturbing you, davening is Hashgacha Pratis, so far that doesn't make our point. But let's go weiter. The Baal Shem Tov says, Ha-dibur hu ha-shchina. This person's dibur, that is the Shechina. The shor sa-shchina b'fiv shel zeh adam, God's presence is within that person's mouth. And why is that happening? In other words, God wants to make it more difficult so that I bring out deeper kaiches and I say, no, I'm not going to be nispal. I'm not going to listen to the fact that there's an interesting conversation. I'm going to rededicate and double my effort to Avodas Hashem. And the words that the Baal Shem Tov uses is that not only God is directing it, but God is, so to speak, within that presence of the person. He goes on to say, and that if that person is not worthy, is less than worthy, the mashal he says is if it's a nachri or a katan. So it's like he somehow says, I don't fully understand the argument, but his point is, then you should do mamish bizrizus because the Shechina is within that person. So zicher, you should do bizrizus and say the my avoida is that I need to refocus on my davening and move forward. This was the Alter Rebbe had to write a letter explaining this issue because people, they asked in Vilna, Hayatachin, to say that God is present within a person, a nachri. How is it possible to say something like that? But here, clearly, what are we looking at for right now? That's Igras HaKadosh Simon Chaf Hey, is the Alter Rebbe's response to that. But what we're looking for now is we're looking to see here you have another teaching where the immanence of God, the immanence of God, the Eibusher is present within everything. Another teaching of Chassidus that expresses that point. Savas Rivash. Here's the next one. The next one we'll summarize briefly outside. Basically, the Rivash said, the says in Savas Rivash number Kuf Tes. It says that when every item has a spark of God within it, right there and then you see that spark of God within it. Okay. Then it says as follows: that a person, when we benefit from food, we benefit not only from the physical food, we also benefit from the spark that's within it. In other words, you could say the body benefits from the physical food. Your neshama benefits from the spiritual spark that's within the food. And then he goes to say, and really, it's not only that you benefit from it, you also give to it. Why? Because the spark, so to speak, is trapped. And when you use it for Avodas Hashem, and that is because you ate, you now went ahead and you served the Eibusher, so now you just elevated that spark and you returned it to its particular source. He goes further and says, this is why human beings have a certain tendency of, I like a certain food or a certain type of a dish, and someone else likes a certain type of dish. So Pashtus, what's the reason? Whatever, it's random. So he says, no, Pi Kabbalah, it's because in that type of food, there are certain type of sparks that are more negeh to my Avodas Hashem, and the other type of food is sparks negeh more to your Avodas Hashem, and that's why this is the way it works out. So the main point to take away from here is we're talking about this concept. The language is a little different. We're not talking about the Shechina, but we're talking about sparks of the Eibusher, divinity. If you want to say that the presence of God isn't in a place, then you're probably not going to want to say that there's a spark of God in a certain place, and so therefore this belongs part of the conversation. By the way, when they did the Mesira, the Alter Rebbe, the second time around, they gave in, Alter Rebbe was arrested twice, so the second time they gave in a ksav, they wrote in, the opposition wrote in things that are problematic about Chassidim. So one of the things is they quoted this Torah, and they said, this is against religion, it's against Judaism. Why is it against Judaism? Because if you say everything I want is a sign from God, there's a spark, what about the fact that I want chazer? What about the fact that I want not treif? So Alter Rebbe actually had to respond to this claim. We have the Alter Rebbe's response, and he responded. He said, I'm not talking about a whimsical feeling, I'm not talking about a taiva, I'm talking about a certain teva, that a person is attracted to a certain type of thing, where there's ways to do it in a way that's mutar, there's ways to do it in a way it's aser. That's what this Torah is talking about. But if a person has at 4:11 p.m. a certain taiva for a certain meichel that's aser, obviously this teaching is not talking about that at all. Alter Rebbe had to respond. Okay, here's another teaching. It's a great principle. In everything there are holy sparks. There is no place that does not have nitzotzes. I want you to keep a mental note on these two words. Even wood and even trees, and even stones. Even an Aveira. What's the logic? Because this God is present in everything and everywhere. God powers every act. And so therefore, even an Aveira, it's hard for, as much as it's difficult for us to say, the Eibusher is in it. If the Eibusher isn't in it, then the hand that did the Aveira would disappear and wouldn't be here, and the action, the nifal of the Aveira wouldn't be able to exist. So yeah, as much as it hurts, the Eibusher is in everything. These are a few examples from the Sefer Tzavos HaRivash. Let's do one example from the Sefer Magid Dvar of Yaakov, which is otherwise known as Likutei Amorim. This was a Sefer that was printed a little earlier, in the 1780s. It's the Torah of the Magid of Mezritch. Here again, it's not that the Magid wrote, it was written by his students. And the Torah basically goes like this. We're familiar with the Medrash. As a Medrash, it says in a few different places that Avram Avinu worshipped the sun and he worshipped the moon. Okay. So the Magid gave a new pirush, a new interpretation into that, into this medrash. Not that he actually worshipped the sun or the moon to say that the sun or the moon is God. No, what happened was that Avram Avinu was able to see the koyach hapoel benifli. He was able to see God's presence in every physical thing. So he saw God in the sun and he saw God in the moon. So he's like, you know something? Not that he worshipped the physical sun, but he worshipped what we would call in the Sprache Chassidus mamala kalaman. He worshipped the level of God as he vests himself and lowers himself to be a creator, and that's what he was worshiping. Then Avram Avinu realized, no, there has to be something higher. The Medrash says it can't be the sun, can't be the moon. It has to be something higher. That's when Avram Avinu says, "Why should I worship God as He lowers Himself to be a creator of the world? I can worship God the way He is, be'etzem, as He is, the way He stands above the act of creation." And so this is the deeper understanding that Avram Avinu came to. Well, what is the underlying idea of this Torah? That the Eibusher is present in the Shemesh and in the Yareach and in everything. And the teaching concludes saying, "V'zeu meloi chal haaretz kvoidoi." This is the meaning of the words, the psukim that say, God's glory fills the whole earth. So glory, what does that mean? You just say, well, because you look everywhere, it brings honor to God. Because I see a nice tree, it makes me think of the Eibusher. So that's saying that's one way of interpreting. And the Mishnah Chassidim would tell you to learn it that way. That it brings honor to God. But the Chassidus teaches, Mloich al Haaretz Kvoidoi, His glory means His presence. That God's presence is Mloich al Haaretz. Sha'af ba'avodah zarah, even in the avodah zarah and chala gilulim and all the terrible things. You have the Netzitzos Kedoshos, and then it quotes another pasuk, Va'ata machayas kulam, you sustain everything. So again, is sustain like I send my messengers, I pull strings, but I'm outside of it? Or is sustain that I vest myself into it? This teaches Kula means that the Eibusher puts himself into everything. So here we're seeing the same idea. Some teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and Tzavos HaRivash, a teaching of the Magid in Likutei Amorim, Magid Dvar of Yaakov, all on the same theme. And again, if you think it over in your head, how many ideas, how many teachings of Chassidus revolve around this principle, you notice that there are many. One last idea, one last story, is Bekesher to today, Chav Dalet Tevis. So there's a Sefer, the first book that came out, like a biography, so to speak, about the Alter Rebbe, came out in 1864. It's called Shivchei Harav. It was put out by someone named Michal Levi Frumkin, and he collected information about the Alter Rebbe. Some parts of the Sefer are more reliable, some parts less. He has over there, he's the makar for the following story. The story goes that a few moments before the Alter Rebbe passed away, on Chav Dalet Tevis, Sha'alas Echad min Echadav, he asked one of his grandchildren, the kavanah is to the Tzemach Tzedek, Hayim ataroya es hakoyra, do you see the beam? In other words, presumably he's lying down. If he's lying down, he's looking up. What do you see when you see up? You see the rafters. So you see all the beam. V'yispali nichtoi ma'al musa shayla. It's a very weird question that Tzemach Tzedek was wondering. V'yomer lo, and the Alter Rebbe said, Taminli, believe me, ki anoichi eineni roya, I don't see the beam. Is called var hagashmi. I only see right now the spiritual matter that sustains everything. The emes is a sikha the Frierdiker Rebbe, where the Frierdiker Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe said that the Maggid told him that 3 days before a person passes away, I don't know if it means every person or some people, rather than seeing the Gashmias, you see the Dvar Hashem that's within it. So here's another example where we clearly see this idea of the Elikus that's present in everything. Okay. with all of this background, now let's come back to the letter of the Alter Rebbe. We saw largely the letter talking about the idea of this vikuach. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? And the Alter Rebbe said it's not setting it up this way, the way you want to do it with the two local judges is not going to work. You have to do it the way I'm proposing, and that is if face-to-face doesn't work out, so then we do it in writing and we send it to Kol Chachmei Yisrael. And so as I said before, in this discussion, the Alter Rebbe is bringing out how much of a philosophical divide there is between them. And now let's read how he describes what that divide is. Zok the Alter Rebbe, Lefi anishma b'medina seinu mi talmidov. What I heard over here, in my area, from the Gra's Talmidim. In other words, I couldn't speak to the Gra himself. So I did research, I spoke to the Gra's Talmidim. And this is what I found out. This is the problem that the Goin has on Sefer Likutei Amorim. This does not mean Tanya. This means Likutei Amorim, the Magid Dvar of Le'Yakov. The problem is that it says that Pirush Mamale Kol Almin. This is a new term. We didn't have this term yet before. But Mamale, the Zohar says, Eibush is Mamale Kol Almin. What does that sound like? He fills up everything. He's present everywhere. The leis hasar panim, there is no place void of him. We say this means kipshutei mamish. It's literal. God is everywhere. And we saw Taka that in Sefer Likutei Amorim we saw one Torah, and there are many more where this is the underlying theme of those Torahs. However, in his eyes, Pikursis Gemura Lemar, it is complete heresy to say to say that God is literally present in literally very low beings. That is epicursis. And according to the letter that I got from you about the fire, that is why they burnt the Sefer Likutei Amorim. They burnt the Sefer Likutei Amorim we asked before. Why? Was it because of Stam, we're in a fight on burning your books? Or was it because of a particular passage? Yes, it was because of a particular passage. Which one? Not one, but which genre of passages? So it seems, based on this information, that it was a genre of passages that spoke about the fact that the Eibusher is in everything. What do they do with the pasuk? And likewise, and all the other phrases that we've had along the way. Hainu hashkacha. They interpret this to mean hashkacha. Now, which means God, there is no place that doesn't have the Eibusher's hashkacha pratis, which is exactly what the Mishnah Chasidim said before. So in other words, Alter Rebbe is saying like this: I don't have first-hand information because I never had an opportunity to discuss it with the Gra. The second-hand information that I got, maybe it's not even second-hand, maybe it's third-hand information, is that this is the Gra's problem. Basically, the Alter Rebbe here is presenting the Gra as following in the footsteps of the Mishnah Chasidim of Emmanuel Chayriki. If you say Tzimtzum Kipshutei, then all of these teachings are highly problematic because it's disrespectful and it's not a good idea. And therefore, you could say Hashkacha Yag, the king could be gazing at Shmutz from inside his palace, but Chas v'Shalom to say that he's inside. The letter continues, and he also says another area where there is a divide. He has a problem with the Sefer Likutei Amorim, with the Sefer, the Magid, and the other similar Svarim, the Inyan Bir Halola Haloas Nitzutzim Me'aklipis. The whole concept of redeeming and raising God's sparks that are present in all things, including Klippa, including negativity. Says Alter Rebbe. So in other words, here we're learning that the Gra had another problem. This whole idea, there's sparks and negativity, and you are able to extract them and elevate it, he doesn't like, and we understand that it's very similar. If you're not going to like the idea God's present everywhere, so then the Kabbalistic idea of the sparks being everywhere is also going to be problematic. Says Alter Rebbe, by the way, this whole concept, if you look in the Zohar, for example, you're not going to find it. Where is Kabbalah Nitzotzis? It's only in the Arizal. It's hinted in the Zohar, but it's not clearly in the Zohar. We know absolutely certain. So before he didn't use those words. For a Tzimtzum Kipshutai, he didn't use those words. In terms of saying that the Alter Rebbe holds like the Mishnah Chasidim, he says, this is the reports I'm getting. Here he says, I know absolutely certain that the Agoyin HaChasid, that the Gra in Imamim Kabbalah's Harizal B'chlala. He doesn't take the Kabbalah, the Rizal, in totality. Thinking that it all comes from Elio. We hold as Chasidim. This is what the Alter Rebbe seems to be saying. This follows a tradition that goes back to the students of the Arizal. That, where did he get his information from? He got his information because at the Gil Elio and everything that he taught came from there. The Gra holds rak ma'at means er mi pi Eliyahu. Only a little came from Eliyahu. V'ashar mechachmasei agdayla, and the rest came from his wisdom, and therefore ein chiyuv lahamin ba. The gam aksavim nishtab shemoid. Also, who wrote what? It's not so clear. Which students wrote the ksavim, and was it transmitted properly? And so therefore the Gra is a little more of a skeptical approach when it comes to Kabbalah Arizal. And so therefore that's another issue. Because we accept everything he says. And he says sparks and clippers. Okay, sparks and clippers. End of story. He's like, no, I don't accept everything that Arizal says. And so therefore he's not ready to go ahead with sparks and clippers. So these are the 2 points, so to speak. Tzimtzum Tussle, not Tzimtzum Tussle. Sparks and clippers, not sparks and clippers, which depends on, do you take everything from the Arizal or do you not take everything from the Arizal? And these are the dividing points of philosophical disputes that really caused for the Gra to be on one side of the equation and for the Alter Rebbe to be on the other side of the equation. Okay, now the question is there anything in the Gra's writing that points in this direction? So we have a little. In other words, till now we didn't hear the Gra's voice. We heard the Alter Rebbe's voice, saying what he knows for sure and what he heard from others. Is there anything in the Gra's voice? So the answer is there is. Why? Because there's a letter that he wrote in Tishrei Tov Kuf Nun Zayin, 1796, where he writes as follows. It's a letter against Chasidim, and he writes, amongst other things, Umilin litzadi lo yamalalu, that's a lashon hapasik. They utter words against God. What are the words that they say against God? Eila lekecha Yisrael. This Jewish people is your God. This is a lashon hapasik of the Chet HaEgel. So in other words, the Chasidim are committing the same sin as the Chet HaEgel. He continues, Kol eitz v'chol even. They're saying about every eitz and every even, Eila lekecha Yisrael. Remember that Tzavos Harivash that said there's sparks in Eitzim Va Avonim that we saw before. Tzavos Harivash Kuf Mem Aleph. It's possible he's referring there. Possible not. Could be it's a coincidence. And they interpret Judaism improperly by saying the pasuk Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkoimai and the pasuk Va'ata Machaya Es Kulam. The second pasuk I know what he means. Va'ata Machaya Es Kulam. Chasidim say that it's not just that God creates everything and even creates every second, but in a way that he stands outside of it. No, they say V'ata Machaya Es Kulam. David is just present in it. So that his Gra feels is a wrong pirush. I understand that. I'm not sure the pasuk Baruch Kvod Hashem Im Koimai. Okay, so here you see, in the Gra's own words, seems to be confirmation for what we have from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe is saying he doesn't like the idea of God in everything, and here we see Yitzhak accuses Chassidim of saying God's everything, and he says that this is idolatry. There also is a pirush that the Gra wrote to a section of Zohar. There's a section of Zohar called Sifra Ditzniusa, the concealed work. And in this section, the Gra writes as follows: Soidat Tzimtzum, hu al pi Soidat Tzimtzum shebesefer Mishnah Chasidim. So right away, he's writing about Tzimtzum in accordance with Mishnah Chasidim. Mishnah Chasidim is the one who holds that Tzimtzum is literal, and here we see the Gra is going to be writing. So right away, it sounds like, oh, okay, you're writing a pirush on that. So does that mean you kind of agree with that? So it kind of leans in that direction. By the way, in this part of the Sifra Ditzniusa, in the first prints of this book, it wasn't there, this passage. It was only there later, but it doesn't matter. It's been confirmed that this is taka from the writing of the Gra. How this was confirmed is beyond the scope. He then goes on to say, he describes the Tzimtzum, and when he talks about the Kav, he calls it Hashgacha. It makes it sound like the Kav is God's Hashgacha. It makes it sound like the presence of God that's in the world is the Hashgacha. So some people look at that and say, oh, so if you're saying Kav is God's Hashgacha, so then basically you're saying is God's presence in this world, which is the Kav, is only Hashgacha, means other than that, his presence is not here. So maybe that also kind of does lean in the direction of saying that Tzimtzum is Kipshutei. Okay, this is vague. At the end of the day, it's vague. We don't have a lot of writing here, not in the first one, not in the second one, but clearly we see something is going on over here. Definitely there is an issue with what Chassidim are saying about the presence of the Eibishter in everything, even if we can't say that exactly what his shitta was about Tzimtzum, but generally we're getting a direction that he's not happy about these many teachings in Chassidus that talk about the presence of God and everything. That pretty much, I think we could say pretty clearly. Okay. Now the Alter Rebbe in Tanya has two big significant parts where he responds. And where he says, no, this is not okay. Tzimtzum's not Kipshuta. Whereas the first place in Shar Yichud V'Amunah, chapter 7. And what's interesting about it is, if you open a Shar Yichud V'Amunah, Perek Zayin, you'll see there's a break, and then it starts a new inyan. What's the whole new inyan? The Alter Rebbe says, now I'm going to come out against those people who say that the Tzimtzum is Kipshutai. He calls it a shkaga of miksas chachamim. Ashkaga miktas chachamim, and he says Hashem yechaper ba'adam, and he says this is a mistake. They're reading the Arizal in the wrong way. He says they say it just means hashkacha pratis, but this is not okay. And he comes up and he goes with an arichis with philosophical arguments about why you can't say tzimtzum is kipshutai. The first thing he says is that you're using a bodily type of experience and a spatial experience as something that transcends that. That in and of itself is reason. But he goes on more and he says more there. Now what's interesting is this first time this appeared in the printed Tanya was in 1902. When the Rebbe Rashab printed the Tanya in Tafrei Samach Beis, it was there. Meaning in the print of the Tanya beforehand, it wasn't there. The Alter Rebbe wrote it. We have it in the Ksavim. We have it in other words, the Bichalach, the manuscripts of Tanya had it. So we know it was there. When the Alter Rebbe gave his Tanya, Shar Yichud V'Amunah, to print, he took out this part that he wrote. Why? We know why. Just like he's saying, don't retaliate when it comes to the fire, when it comes to the burning of the books, because that's not the way to achieve peace. So he didn't think that writing an essay against showing the problems and the mistakes of Tzimtzum Kipshuta, he assumed that this wasn't a good idea for the peace, and so therefore he took it out, which is an amazing thing. Tafrei Samach Beis, it was put in. This is one place where you have this idea. Second place is in Igeres HaKodesh Siman Chav Hey, where they wrote, Hayatachin to write that the presence of God is in the person who's disturbing the person who's davening. So he gets into it over there again. And there he says a different nekuda. He says, by the way, history is on my side. He says, because if you would go back previous generations and you go to a Jewish man or a Jewish woman, well, that wasn't a philosopher. You say, where is God? Alter Rebbe says, I'm sure they would have said God's everywhere. This is what he says. I'm sure they would have said God is everywhere. It's a new thing, he says. He calls a Chadashim Mikarev Bo that came up with this Chakira. But the idea, why? Because Yidden always knew the pasuk as a Shema V'Sarat Ani Maleh, and they always took it literally. And so this is tradition. So in addition to the philosophical arguments, he says, we have tradition that is on our side. Okay. Now the next turn in this story, in this plot, comes a Sefer Nefesh HaChaim that was written by Reb Chaim of Volozhin. Reb Chaim of Volozhin, his dates are very close to the Alter Rebbe. He was born in 1749, and he passed away in 1821. He was one of the star students of the Gra, and he wrote a Sefer Nefesh HaChaim. And in the Sefer Nefesh HaChaim, he addresses this issue about the Tzimtzum, this issue of whether you could say God is in everything or not. Let's read what he has to say in number 18. Nefesh HaChaim, Shar Gimel, Perek Gimel, he says as follows. Uve'emes, the truth is, I don't want to talk about this. Because the earlier ones didn't talk about it. But I reconsidered. It used to be a good idea to not discuss this. Today, where everyone is talking about it, and even you have fools who are saying, everything and in everything, there is God. And all day they're thinking about this. And not only they're thinking about it, and they're behaving in accordance to this. In other words, it's affecting what they do and what they don't do. There's the Eibishter in this person, so that means I need to react in this way or in that way. The Shekhinah is here, and so therefore I should take it as more encouragement that I should what I should be thinking or not be thinking during I'm davening. Or if you go back to that other teaching, it was action oriented. Look at it as if, just like you're looking at this bottle that the Eibishter is here, so you should realize that Eibishter is mamish present in front of you. In other words, it's not just a philosophical idea. It's lamaisa. It's something to behave upon, to think about and behave upon. So he says, because of that, so therefore I need to talk about it. The kama zehirus, you say that you need to be really careful about this. Why? If we're going to think about this, if we're going to allow this philosophy of God everywhere to trickle down into the way we think and behave, what's the end result? You're going to come up with a heter al pi machshava according to this thinking, to think about Torah, even in improper places. Why? Because God is everywhere. So in other words, why am I so bothered by this? I'm so bothered by this, but because if we allow this idea to get out of control, so then the next thing you know is there's no such a thing as mekaymes metunafim. You're allowed to do holy things, study and daven everywhere and anywhere. It's not the only thing. Other mistakes, he doesn't specify, but he says other mistakes can happen. But again, look at this. He stresses not if you learn this idea. He stresses when is it problematic? When this idea trickles down into a patterned way of thinking and of doing. And so therefore, I want to discuss this. So what does it sound like? You read this. It sounds like he's going to go on and say that you're not allowed to say it. non-Chasidim, Yosher Levov. God's not present in all of this. He removed himself from here. That's what it sounds like he's going to say. But Paul, he's not going to say that. He's going to say something different. Let's see what he actually says. So here, Shar Gimel Prakim Dalet and Hey, he says as follows. It says in a number of places in the Zohar about the Eibishter that he's Mamale Kolamin v'Soiviv Kolamin. Now here again, I need you to forget anything you ever heard of the term what does Mamale Kolamin mean and what does Soiviv Kolamin, because you're going to learn now his pirush and what Mamale Kolamin and Soiviv Kolamin mean. So let's see what he has to say. He's going to say Mamale Kolamin and Soiviv Kolamin is a question of perspective. Our perspective about God needs to be that the Eibishter is Soiviv Kolamin. And we'll see how he interprets that in a minute. God's perception, which is the truth, is that he's Mamale Kolamin. Let's read inside. From God's perspective, why he fills up all the world, because it's true, God takes up, God's present everywhere. However, from our perspective, which means the way we're commanded about how to engage in Torah and mitzvahs, and what we're able to understand, here God is called Soiviv Kolamin. In other words, Mamale Kolamin is concealed from us. Mamale Kolamin is the MS that is concealed from us. We're not privy to it. What does this mean? It's true. From God's perspective, even now, after He created the world, still the Eibishter is Mamale Kol Ha'olamis V'Hamakomis V'Habriyos Kulam B'Shivui Gomer V'Achtos Pashut. God is everywhere. God is in everything, in complete equality. Is one and the same Achtos, the same unity in everywhere. And that's Mamale Kolamin. Despite that, Tzimtzum Kavayachol Kvoidi is where God also made a Tzimtzum. To allow the elements to come about, which means to come good places. And so in other words, the Tzimtzum allowed the world to come into existence. Remember, God is everywhere. That doesn't change. Before the Tzimtzum, after the Tzimtzum, God is everywhere. What did the Tzimtzum allow? Tzimtzum enabled that now you can have higher levels, lower levels, Kedusha, Tumah, and all these types of things. And this is our perspective. We're only able to comprehend how things appear. And based on this, and God's laws revolve around what? God's laws revolve around our perception and our reality, which is Soiviv Kolamin. We have to look at God as Soiviv, and he says, I didn't bring the exact quote here, but he says this, Soiviv, God is outside. God is not here. Soiviv, he's not here. Why? Because the fact that we feel that way is because that God set it up that way. Don't try to fight that on. Don't try to push that away. God set up that system. It means you need to think along those terms. And Torah and mitzvahs and all the laws and all of halacha is following a pattern that Soiviv Kolamin, God's not here. The emes is Mamale Kolamin. That's God's perspective. So this is what he says. People look at this, they're like, amazing, crazy. You're talking about over here, the Talmud of the Gra, of Reb Chaim Velozhin. If we're right, the Alter Rebbe says that he heard from the Talmudim that the Gra holds Tzimtzum Kipshutai, literal, he removed himself, like the Mishnah Siddim, like the Yosher Level. Which means the only way you could talk about God's presence is Hashgacha, that he's providence, that he's God, he's overseeing what's happening. He's in control of what's happening. But to say that God is present, you can't say, which is why you have to reinterpret M'loi Chal Haaretz Kvoidei, right? M'loi Chal Haaretz Kvoidei, the Alter Rebbe says, he has to reinterpret to God Hashgacha. The Nefesh HaChaim doesn't have to reinterpret M'loi Chal Haaretz Kvoidei. Nefesh HaChaim, M'loi Chal Haaretz Kvoidei is literal. God is everywhere, from his perspective. And it's the emes, and it's the truth. You shouldn't be thinking about that, but that's another story. But the emes is, M'loi Chal Haaretz Kvoidei, God is everywhere. So did Reb Chaim of Velozhin break with the Gra? That's what it sounds like. So now this turns into a whole discussion. Are there other instances where his student broke from his Rebbe, where he said differently? Some people point out that there are differences. There's a letter of the Rebbe where the Rebbe says that if you take this with the letter of the Alter Rebbe that we saw before, then the inevitable conclusion is that indeed he did break. Because Tzimtzum was kipshuta in the Torah of the Gra, and here you see the Tzimtzum is not kipshuta in the Torah of the Gra. Okay, so on one level, that's a very, very interesting thing. However, it's also important to point out another nikud. And that is, and sometimes it gets lost in the conversation over here. According to the Nefesh HaChaim, according to the Chaim Volozhiner, all of the Teiros that we saw before are not okay. All of the Teiros that we saw from the Tzavos Rivash, all of the Teiros that we saw from the Maggid are not okay. Why? Because although he doesn't disagree with the fact that God's present and everything, but he thinks that on an operational level, we shouldn't be thinking about that. And definitely, that's why the whole time, if you notice, he's like, the problem is when you think about it in a way that now it becomes a part of your daily life, that crosses a line. It should not be part of your life. It's a philosophical truth that you need to know because it's the MS, and that's the pshat in the pasuk. So when you read the pasuk, you should think about it, that it becomes a guide in life to find God in everything that's off the table. You find the Eibishter through Limud HaTorah. That's the way you find the Eibishter. Don't tell me that you're accessing God and that you're experiencing and you feel the Dvar Hashem in everything. Chassidus is trying to go in the opposite direction. Chassidus, as much as it wants people to learn Torah and mitzvahs and all of that, wants people to try to be mizbeinin before davening. You're going to think about how the Dvar Havaya is present in everything and it's bottle. The physical thing is bottle to the likus that's within each thing. All the Chassidus is this, and all those teachings that we saw from the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid were also about that. He will still have a problem with that. So we shouldn't jump too far and say, even if he broke from the Gra on the larger philosophical question, it doesn't mean that he agrees with all of those. In other words, perhaps he too could have agreed with the book burning, even though he would have agreed with. Okay, so that, if you want to really have a good time, then you could say, and maybe that was the Gra held. Maybe that's what the Gra held. Maybe this is the shita of the Gra. In other words, maybe the Gra didn't really hold Tzimtzum Kipshutei Mamish. Maybe everything that we just said about the Nefesh HaChaim was the Gra. Okay, but the Alter Rebbe didn't assume that. The Alter Rebbe writes in his letter, and it seemed that, because what language did we have from the Gra? That he says, Eitzva, Even is a problem. Yeah, Nefesh HaChaim would also say that. What was the Lashon? He said, in the pasuk v'ata machayas kulam. Yeah, because he would say, because you're not supposed to see the likus and everything. You're not supposed to experience it. You're not supposed to try to experience it. You're not supposed to say that, right? So that could work well with the Gra's words in that letter from Yud Aleph Tifrei Tov Kuf Nun Zayin. The Nefesh HaChaim's words could work well. So you could explore that maybe the Gra also is the same shit. But at the end of the day, the Alter Rebbe assumed nishtazoi. He didn't say Yodea Bebirur, which he said about the other thing, but the Alter Rebbe assumed nishtazai. That's why there's a letter in the Rebbe where he also assumes that the Gra held like the non-Chasidim, which is why the Nefesh HaChaim is breaking with him. And I'm pointing out, no problem, but at the same time, we have to recall the Nefesh HaChaim is not going to be endorsing all of these Toidas that we're going to have to say. And so therefore, if you pause here, you're basically able to say, okay, all of a sudden, these are very, we know when we speak about Chasidim versus non-Chasidim, we talk about the role of the Rebbe, or you talk about the role of prayer, right? But this is a major, major issue. And it seems that, at least from the Alter Rebbe's perspective, when he wanted to talk about the major things that divide the Gra and him, this is what he zeroed in on. This question, can we find God in everything? Should we be thinking about God in everything? Is that an important part of our Avodas Hashem, or is it basically something to ignore? And at least on that question, the Gra and the Nefesh HaChaim are on the same page. The answer for them would be no, even if there's two different reasons why no. Because it's not true, or because it's not relevant to you. Okay, so there's two different ways of coming to that. But at the end of the day, these are two very different perspectives on how to live life. And the implications are huge, as becomes apparent, because it affects so many different areas in the Rebbe's Torah. Now, it affects many areas in Chassidus. Okay, so let's conclude now. What's interesting is that Rebbe discussed this issue, this debate, on a number of occasions. And we'll spend 2-3 minutes on this issue right now. Throughout the years, the Rebbe showed a shtickle of I guess you could say a bias to justify the other position. To justify the position that says literal tzimtzum. There were times that the Rebbe said, what do you mean? You're talking about the level before the tzimtzum, right? You're talking about the levels of the tzimtzum. So if you're talking about such high levels, anything is possible. So you're going to start, the Alter Rebbe in Shar Yichud V'Emunah writes an entire essay of what's philosophically possible, what makes sense. Anything's possible. Bleak vol, you're talking about Ein Sof, no limitations. So this could happen, that could have happened. That's one point that Rebbe said on a few occasions. Another point that Rebbe said on a few occasions is you have to remember these are Gdolei Yisrael Amitim, they're real sages. What do they care about? They care about God's honor, Kvod Hashem. How could you say God isn't something impure? And so therefore, you can't laugh at this position. You have to respect this position even if you disagree with it. Fine. So these are some points that the Rebbe said throughout the years. But the most radical of all the times that Rebbe spoke about this, and there are a few, is Nasei Mem Gimel. In Nasei Mem Gimel, the Rebbe said, is in order to understand the Alter Rebbe's Shitta, I need to suspend my seichel. I need to suspend my seichel. He said it's Nasev and Nishma. Nasev and Nishma. And he says, I asked around many people to explain to me, how does it make sense to say that God is present in impure things? And I never received a satisfactory answer. And so therefore, if you want to know which view makes more sense, not that it also makes a little sense, if you want to know which view makes more sense, the other view is the view that makes more sense. It's just a mind-blowing idea. Why? Why is mind-blowing? So that's one thing. No, because I just established before how many Titus Chassidus are all meyusid on the fact that Tzimtzum is not kipshutai. Hundreds. Hundreds of Titus. It's not just your localized issue in Perek Zayin and Shar Yichud V'Amunah. A localized issue in Igeres HaKodesh Siman Chav Hey. No, it's an issue that pervades hundreds and hundreds of teaching Chassidus. So now when you come and say that what underlies it doesn't make so much sense and the other view makes more sense, it's a very, very radical statement. So if we want to say that the Nefesh HaChaim in a certain way walked away from the Gra, the Rebbe, so to speak, is loosening the cohesion, is loosening the grip with the Torah of the Alter Rebbe. Not that the Rebbe said it's not true. Nasav and Nishma. It's 100% true. Tzimtzum Einei Kipshutai. But this kind of a perspective of, yeah, what a ridiculous thing to say. It makes no sense. They said that. The Rebbe throughout the years consistently was not his approach. Very respectful. And in this case, even saying it makes more sense. I'm going with the Alter Rebbe because of Nasav and Nishma. Because remember, the Alter Rebbe himself said that it's not all chakira. What do Jews believe for hundreds of years? Okay, fine. That mitzvah that the Rebbe is saying, I'm going to go along and say that the Tzimtzum is not literal. Anyway, let's conclude by reading the ending of this letter of the Alter Rebbe. We saw many of the parts, and now let's conclude with the ending. The Alter Rebbe needed to give them encouragement because he told them you can't retaliate. So if you can't retaliate, so what? We just had our sefer burnt. Says Alter Rebbe as follows. You think this is a new thing that your book was burnt. This already happened. Who is greater than the Moshe of his generation, who's the Rambam? Where he was in Sfard, and I guess in the other areas where he lived, where people knew him, everything was good. In the far places where people didn't know him, they said he's a heretic and they burnt his books. And who did it? Great sages did it. The Alter Rebbe here is basically drawing a parallel between our day, his day, and their day, and the Rambam's day. The people who really know us, who live closely with us, who are willing to have meetings with us and talk to us, they know we're good. The people who don't, and therefore don't know us, they think we have these problems. And they're the ones who burnt their books. That's a very similar lashon in Shar Yichud V'Amunah, in Perek Zayin, when he's talking about Tzimtzum Kipshuta, he uses a very similar lashon. Shigas mixas chachamim be'einayim. So he's really drawing a parallel here. Okay. Why? Because they read what the Rambam said in Ilchus Tshuva, and they assumed that he doesn't believe in Tchias HaMeisim, so they said he's a heretic, they burnt his books. The Rebbe is referring to here, there's actually multiple disputations or debates about the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe is referring to here something that happened in the 1230s, where the Rambam Sorim were burnt in the southern part of France. Here the Alter Rebbe is saying that the main issue was whether the Rambam believed in Tchias HaMeisim or not. It's really a broader subject to get into what exactly was going on at the time. That's not our nekuda. They didn't think the problem was in them, that they weren't understanding things properly. However, as time went along, the gam sinasam, this is a pasuk in Koheles, gam sinasam gam kinasam kfar avda, the hate and the jealousy disappeared, the titzmach emes me'eretz, and the truth merged. The Yod, Ukol Yisrael, Ki Moshe Emes Esaras Emes, and everyone knew that the Rambam is right. And so too will be to us. So don't be disheartened. Yes, you're going through a difficult time, but it's going to happen. And largely, why is it going to happen, or why did it happen? Is because from here, and we spoke about this other times as well, the Alter Rebbe's commitment to navigating this dispute in a way where it doesn't get out of hand. And that's why it was successful. And so I think there's a moidig lesson, first of all, besides for the general approach that we learn from this, about something that's foundational to all the Chassidus, but also remember that as important as that was, Alter Rebbe also took it out of Shara Yichud V'Amunah in order to retain the peace. And maybe even the Rebbe and the things that he was saying was also geared at least partially in that direction. And that's something to think about as we go about our lives.